Okay, hello everybody. Today we're going to be wrapping up our discussion on the Gilded Age by visualizing it. So let's go ahead and get started by talking about demographic trends. So by the turn of the 20th century, the United States had more large cities than any other country in the world. By the 1920 census, the majority of Americans also lived in urban areas, and that's a shift. Between 1860 and 1900, the United States population doubled. Just some interesting examples here. New York's population was about 800,000 in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War, and it was 3.5 million by 1900. Chicago's population was just shy of 110,000 by 1860, and it was 1.6 million in 1900. So Chicago exploded. In 1840, there were 131 cities that were considered large cities, and by those days' standards, that was a city that was over 2,500 people. By 1900, there were 1,700 cities that large. And there also was a shift in the source of immigration. You start to see more immigrants coming from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, so Italy, Poland, also Russia, and you're seeing an influx of Jewish immigrants also from Eastern Europe, and you're also seeing more immigrants arriving from China and Japan. Just a few push factors to keep in mind there. The source of Italian immigration is largely because the country of Italy unified in the 1870s, and that caused quite a bit of instability in that region. And there was a rapid escalation of anti-Semitism at the turn of the 20th century. So, and additionally, there's instability in Eastern Europe, particularly surrounding the Russian Revolution. So that leads to that influx, quite a bit of instability in Asia. Just to name a few examples, the Qing dynasty is on the verge of collapse by the turn of the 20th century. And in Japan, in the late 19th century, the Meiji Restoration led many Japanese farmers to become landless. So in terms of pull factors, land and homesteading was a huge pull to the United States, especially in the West. And then in urban areas, which we'll focus on now, we see many job opportunities there, of course, as the United States continues to industrialize. So I like to look at architecture. I think it is a really interesting way to examine a city. And since Chicago is a very new city, particularly because the city virtually burned down in 1871, we start to see a new style of architecture, most well known by Louis Sullivan, who lived in the late 18th, early 20th centuries. His contributions to the Chicago School of Architecture sort of fall in line with the form follows function style. And what that means is that the appearance of a building is less important than its utility. That's very different. Here's just one more building in Chicago worth noting, this form over function style. And interesting also that it's a retail store. We're going to see the growth of department stores, particularly after World War I. We'll get back to that soon. And then shifting gears to New York, we're seeing more of that, we're seeing more of that function follows form. For some reason, I got confused for a moment with my word order. Anyway, the idea that aesthetics still are very important to buildings in New York City. Typically, of course, it's an older city that impacts the style. And one of the other reasons for that is that still most major businesses in the United States had their headquarters in New York. Chicago was more of a city known for meat packing and railroad industries. So these buildings, rather, in many ways became the logos for the companies that built them. And in New York also, at least at that time, this isn't the case anymore, skyscrapers tended to be taller. Actually, the Flatiron Building, constructed in 1902, was the tallest building at the time. I believe it's 20 stories tall. Still a really iconic building in New York now. And then speaking of iconic, the Brooklyn Bridge was also built during the Golden Age, 1883. And here we go, Brooklyn Bridge again, 1913. And of course, the Statue of Liberty, gifted by France, also in the Gilded Age. So, of course, it's important for us to remember that in the Gilded Age, there's also that rot underneath. So let's take a moment to zoom in on tenements. And they are really best known, I think, in New York. Many of them still exist, although, of course, there have been reforms and regulations since then. But these tenements oftentimes were called dumbbell tenements. because of the shape of the building footprint. You had sort of this air shaft in the middle that created this narrow-waisted shape of a dumbbell, and the wide part of it faced the street and the backyard. And these, in general, they were built in great numbers to accommodate these waves of immigrants coming from places like Eastern Europe and Asia. And side streets of Manhattan's Lower East Side are still lined with many of these dumbbell structures today. I'm not sure if these buildings still stand. This is quite an old photograph. It looks like from the cars. I approximated that it was in the 1980s, but many of them in the lower village still exist. And Chicago is just also fascinating because the city virtually burned down after the Great Chicago Fire of '71. So thinking about the statistics I mentioned prior about how quickly Chicago's population exploded are even more noteworthy. Let's think about also how there's this middle class developing at this time period. As I mentioned before, we see the rise of corporations. And of course, they have their headquarters in large cities like New York and Chicago. So what you see is the emergence of what we call white collar workers. So they're not doing any sort of manual labor. They're typically in middle management positions and just doing different administrative jobs. And so we're talking about things like floor managers, accountants, clerical workers, salespeople. And there's also a greater demand in this middle management sector for careers like doctors and lawyers. And these are good paying occupations. And it's just important for us to understand that this is triggering a rise in the middle class, something that we'll continue to see happening throughout the 20th century. Again, zeroing in on the destitute poverty that existed in many American cities at the time. There's no better way to do that than, again, to visualize it. And I want to bring attention to this very iconic book called How the Other Half Lives. It was published in 1890 by Jacob Riis, who was a Danish immigrant who photographed the New York City tenement slums. And in the late 19th century, the flash bulb was invented, which allowed Riis to take flash photography of the insides of these buildings. And many readers really had not had a glimpse of the sort of interior of the rot of the Gilded Age before Riis published this book, which ended up being a bestseller at the time. So by the turn of the 20th century, and all of these photos are from How the Other Half Lives, I should just mention. Anyway, by the turn of the 20th century, about 2/3 of all working Americans worked for wages. And we're talking about at least typically more than a 10-hour shift, if not more than that, at least 6 days a week, often 7. The average wages were less than $380 a year, and if we adjust that for inflation, that's less than $11,000 annually, which is still poverty wages. Many poor immigrants settled in tenements, and again, these are really small apartments, and they're often only one room. Life in the tenements was really different from one city to the next. So you can see this one here. There's a fairly sizable family. You can see how dirty and crowded the room is. And another thing worth noting is that very few, if any, of these tenements had their own private bathroom. So typically they would have one bathroom on a floor, and dozens of people would share that one facility. I mentioned immigrants before, but it's just interesting to zero in on a couple of neighborhoods. So in New York City, we're seeing here an image of Little Italy at the turn of the 20th century. And that's roughly the same area today. I know this is somewhere on Mulberry Street. I just don't know the cross street. So here's Mulberry Street in New York today. I mentioned the influx of Jewish immigrants, especially because anti-Semitism was escalating at the turn of the 20th century. This is a predominantly Jewish neighborhood at the time, Hester Street. And if we look at this neighborhood today, it's in Little Italy. And also Little Italy abuts Chinatown, which has actually grown in size. Little Italy has gotten smaller. But here is that, this is actually, I believe, very close to where this photo was taken on Doyer Street. So a very, very iconic part of Chinatown in New York City today. Just very briefly looking at religion, unsurprisingly, because immigrants are speaking all different kinds of languages. Many of them want to be able to attend church services with their local community. So you start to see the growth of many different churches from many different immigrant communities, and many of them still stand, as we see this one here in Chicago for the Polish community. And this is maybe a slightly different image here, but again, I mentioned that Chicago is sort of the hub of the meatpacking industry, and we also see that in other Midwestern cities. This is representing a meatpacking process in Cincinnati. And one thing, it's a really kind of interesting and kind of cool image to look at, but if you really zero in on what these workers are doing, you can tell this doesn't look particularly sanitary. We have meat, just slabs of it, going down onto the floor. We're going to revisit this when we talk about muckraking, Upton Sinclair. There will be reactions to this relatively soon. Okay, cool. So I'm pretty sure that's just about it for now. Actually, no, I lied. Let's talk very quickly about machine party politics, and then we'll end. So another thing that's really important to consider in urban America around the turn of the 20th century is political development. So the political machine, it's not a literal machine, it's a metaphor. And what it represents is the kind of control that a major political party has on a population. The best example, again, zeroing in on New York, is the political machine run by the Democratic Party in New York City. It was called Tammany Hall. Its boss was William, aka Boss Tweed. And these political machines would promise improvements to their communities. Again, their communities were predominantly immigrants in exchange for their votes. Another thing, just a side note, is that there are racial implications here. We know that the Democratic Party tended to be the party also of the Jim Crow South. And in cities, even though in this example we're talking about a northern city, the Democratic Party sort of did still contribute to racial tension in the sense that they a lot of times would cater more to the concerns of the European immigrant community, and they often feared a migration of African Americans fleeing the Jim Crow South, searching for jobs in cities. So it's an indirect connection, but one worth mentioning nonetheless. And since we've been staring at this cartoon for a minute here, let's just analyze it. Again, as I said, William Tweed was the boss of Tammany Hall. And so what this cartoon is saying is that New York is under Tweed's thumb, that it is completely under his influence, completely under his control. And New Jersey looks on. This is showing us, again, I believe this is supposed to represent Tweed. This says Tammany, so Tammany Hall. And you see his control that he is largely exercising over the front horse, the horse of the Democratic Party. And maybe because the Republican horse is bucking, that means that he's kind of thwarting the progress of the Republican Party and trying to propel the Democratic Party forward. And then in this case, again, you see this representation of, I think this is supposed to be Tweed, but even if it's not, this is supposed to be the representation of the just broad machine itself. The fact that they're portraying this figure as obese is showing him as full and corrupt with greed. And you see that he's leaning over this ballot box and it says, "In counting there is strength." So this massive influence over the vote ultimately is criticizing machine party politics. All three of these cartoons are very critical of these political machines in New York City. And Thomas Nast, the cartoonist, we've seen much of his work before, was a well-known Republican, a well-known critic of the Democratic Party at the time. Okay, cool, let's just wrap it up. Again, just a really important question to zero in on, based not only on what you saw here, but on the previous video. I want you to just stop and ponder this question here. To what extent did industrialization and growth of the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century improve the lives of American people? Don't just think about evidence from this photo essay here. Think about evidence from rural America. Think about our previous discussions of the Gilded Age that I mentioned in other videos, things like railroad strikes. And that's it for now. We'll pick back up by discussing the Jim Crow South in our next video. Thanks for watching.